Okay, welcome to Chapter 1 of our exploration of criminal justice. This is part of the Introduction to Criminal Justice at Wake Tech, CJC 111. If you're listening to this, you are either in my online class or you are in one of my hybrids and you're sitting through some of this lecture again. Just quickly, we're going to go through the PowerPoints for each one of these chapters, and we're going to really focus a little bit on things outside of the chapters. There's going to be a few things I want to highlight, but we're going to pretty much follow the text, because if you had to pay for the text, there's no reason why you shouldn't get your money's worth out of it. So let's move on. This is an overview, this kind of chapter of the whole course. It introduces many of the topics that entire chapters will be devoted to later. Being aware, of course, that each of these chapters in turn is typically a course in and of itself. So Chapter 2, where we'll look at the causes of crime, is an expansion on a few of the things we'll talk about in this chapter, but also we have a separate course on that called Criminology that you can take that expands it even further. That really means that I can only touch the surface quite a bit, and you need to understand that this is a limited course in that regard. I also will be providing some supplemental material involving North Carolina and recent events that will be added to what we covered in the text. You shouldn't expect most of that to show up on the weekly quizzes, although could show up in the midterm or the final. Okay, what I like to do before most of these chapters is challenge the student to think a little bit about what we're studying and why. So I call these mainly questions to ask before beginning. The first thing that's important in discovery is to understand what we know and to appreciate that some of what we know probably isn't true. So what do you know about criminal justice? Is what you know true? And conversely, what do we know that we later discover is false? And having discovered it's false, how does that change what we do? Now, to be fair, we'll talk a little bit now about objective and subjective reality. Objectively, we can know certain things with near complete certitude. Without getting too deep into the weeds, there is an objective reality that we can measure. So we can determine, for example, what the speed of light is. We know that the speed of light is roughly 186,000 miles a second. That's something we can judge. If you're asking me in the criminal justice field, what kind of gun fired this bullet? And if it's a .38 caliber bullet, I'm going to assure you that it was fired by in all probability, a .38 caliber gun. Couldn't have been fired by one with a smaller bore at the very least. However, there's some things that are important in criminal justice that are really subjective reality. And these are things that we can hope to know, that we can prove perhaps to a degree of certitude, but we can't be objectively certain. An example would be the motive for an action, say a motive for murder. If you apprehend someone who has killed another human being and you want to know why did he do it, and it's important because if he did it in, say, self-defense, then there exists in the law a justification or an excuse. If, however, he did it just in a course of a robbery, then his motivation there in fact makes the crime worse. It triggers something in North Carolina called the murder-felony rule. The problem is, while we objectively can know what caliber of gun killed him, we can't objectively know why. Because one way you could do it is you could ask him, why did you kill that person? And he could tell you the truth, or he could tell you a falsehood. If you want to find out his motive, you can look at other things. What was he doing at the time? How was the weapon handled? And this can lead you to a certain degree of proof that will confirm what you think is true, but it's still a subjective opinion. So let's just leave it with asking the question before we start, What do we think is true, but in fact isn't? Now, these learning objectives are going to be present at the beginning of most of these chapters. They're really more for Wake Tech students, things I want to cover, not terribly critical for us to look at in these lectures. Okay. Each one of the chapters starts off with a kind of little popular blurb or something. In this case, it's talking about Smits, who sent threats via tweet to Senator Roy Blunt about lax rules for gun control and how he went to jail or didn't go to jail for that. John Ravello sent a Twitter that had a GIF file that had a strobe image in it, and he sent it to Kurt Eichenwald, knowing that he was an epileptic. The strobe triggered an epileptic seizure. So both of those, kind of introduce you to the concept of crime and how it changes and when some action is or isn't a crime and what protects it. I'll let you read those. I think they're good little thought experiments. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time reviewing them. Okay, one of the things I start most of my lectures with is looking at our data. So let's look at crime rates for the last 25 years that we have good data for. And most of these are pretty much based upon statistics gathered from different police departments and reported to the FBI and then published in what's called the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports. So this is a surprise to most people. In the last 25 years, crime has fallen dramatically. We are now at rates that we really haven't seen since the 1960s. If you look at violent crimes per 100,000 people, or if we look at the Bureau of Justice numbers, or we look at the property crimes, Bureau of Justice as well, or Justice Statistics, you'll notice that crime rates have fallen at least 50% in most cases, arguably more when it comes to certain other categories. So most people would say, I know that crime is up, when in fact, crime is down. So this is one of the examples of what we know to be true, but it's in fact a falsehood. That requires us to readjust our thinking. That requires us to go back and say, where am I getting my sources for believing that crime was high when in fact it's low, comparatively at least? And how does that change how we think about crime? How should it change why not? Why did crime fall? Great questions. We want to start off at a very basic level with asking a question, what is crime? Now, typically, a crime is simply, at its very core, a violation of the law. But that doesn't get you too far. Because, like many simple words, crime, love, hate, the simpler the word, very often, the more complex the idea behind it. When we talk about crime, one of the interesting things is there's a step before we define crime. You really should ask yourself when you start your introduction of criminal justice, why are some things crimes and some things not? Who got to make this decision that this thing, murder, rape, arson, burglary, prostitution, drug use, those are crimes, and these other things are not crimes? Who gets to decide this? And how does this impact the whole system? So in the 1890s, I know it's a long time ago, Anatole France wrote this pretty famous quote, in its majestic equality, the law forbids the rich and the poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal loaves of bread. It comes out of, I believe it was a novel, The Red Lily, published in 1894. This introduces the idea that for seemingly an objectively neutral thing, like it's illegal for everybody to sleep under a bridge, it's illegal for everybody to steal a loaf of bread, that law doesn't apply to a large segment of society that has no need to do those things. It only applies to a certain group that does. So the example there, a little bit more modern, is if you look at that cartoon, if you're poor and get caught with drugs, it's a crime. Cartoon says I'm doing 9 months for possession. If you're rich and get caught with drugs, it's a scandal. And you can see, I assume the image there is kind of a Hollywood starlet or someone rich saying, I'm going to rehab. So be aware that there was a determination here that was made about what was and wasn't a crime and when it applies. People operate on the perception that street crime is the greatest threat. If you ask most people what's the worst crime, they'll probably say murder, rape, arson. You notice those are all pretty much violent crimes. And they might say, oh, I'm worried about being a victim. If we looked at America today and we looked at the attitudes of people, what they know, okay, versus what is true, the group that shows among the highest fear of crime is rural, elderly, white women. Ironically, the group that we know statistically is among the least likely to be victims of crime are rural, white, elderly women. Conversely, among the groups that show the least fear of crime, urban, minority, young males. But the group that is the most, or certainly close to the most likely to be a victim, not a perpetrator, a victim of crime, are urban, male, minority youths. So we can even go further in this. Let's look at this next chart. This next chart has to do with theft, stealing, which people would all admit would be a crime. Okay, so over here on this side, these are all the crimes that are criminalized. You notice when we use the term larceny, that's when I take something from you. If I steal your laptop while you're out of the room, that's a larceny. Burglary, a little bit more specific. Usually a burglary is you break into someone's home and steal something from it. Auto theft, that's self-explanatory. Robbery is rarest of all. You'll notice that even though it's the amount of money there, 0.34 billion or 340 million, a lot of money, robbery is when you steal something from someone's person. Now you'll notice that in all of these, very often in every police department, there are special units that investigate and prosecute these people. And we can spend hundreds of millions of dollars setting up a system to track auto thieves, to arrest them, to prosecute them, to protect automobiles. And we can involve the state to register the automobiles, and we can involve the police to issue license plates and track them. And then we can do investigations about grand theft auto. But look at the blue side of this chart. To put it simply, if your employer steals from you, okay, that's going to be on this side, maybe in the robbery charge if you actually, if your employee steals from you, that's going to be on the blue side. But if you steal from your employer, that's going to be on this side. What that means is for things like when you don't pay people the minimum wage that's required, when you don't pay them overtime when it's required, when you don't give them restroom, or when you make them work off the clock and don't pay them. All those are far, far, far more likely to occur than you being robbed in the street, or your car being stolen, or almost any other type of theft. So the public doesn't appreciate that most theft, one could argue, if we just started, is from the boss taking from the worker, not from the worker taking from the boss, or street crime. You'll notice that we don't have separate squads inside police departments for, did someone get paid overtime? Did you not get a break? And you know, I've had students say, well, how important is a rest break violation? Well, I hate to break it to you, but I was just listening to a report this morning in August of 2021 about how failure to give people rest breaks has led to deaths of heat exhaustion. And there was a case of up to 50 of these recently being tracked. So it can be a serious thing. It can lead to death. But you would never think, well, I'm going to prosecute someone because they didn't give them a rest break. They might be told, well, you got to stop it. They might be fined, but it's pretty rare. Okay, two other concepts I want to introduce are ethnocentrism and chronocentrism. These are important as we go forward because we're all kind of trapped by both of these ideas. Ethnocentrism is the idea that your society, that the experience that you have lived is what is normal and what is right. So I grew up in a much different time than most of you that are alive today. I am a child of the 1960s, which meant my formative experience is much different than the people who are children of the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s or the 2020s. So when I examine things, I very often, whether I know it or not, bring these ideas in that this is what is normal and right. Some of that is because of the society I was in, how I was raised in a suburb, or if I was raised black, or if I was raised white, or if I was raised Christian, or if I was raised Jew. Some of it has to do with the time you're in. So that's the belief that what's going on now is what is normal. Sometimes we will glorify what's in the past or hope for what's in the future, but very often we live that what's going on now is what is normal. And the cartoon over there, I couldn't believe I actually found ethnocentric. The famous joke, the chicken crossed the road. Why did you cross the other road? The chicken is saying, how do I get to the other side? And the other chicken says, you are on the other side. Because from his perspective, yeah, you're on the other side. Okay, determining criminal behavior, it's not easy to determine what's right and wrong because, of course, different countries have different ideas of what is and isn't a crime. Even different states in the United States have different definitions. There are some counties in Nevada where it's legal to have prostitution, and not in North Carolina. There are some states in the United States where it's legal to possess marijuana, not in North Carolina. There are some states in the United States where it's okay to assist in a suicide or have euthanasia, not in North Carolina. So every state in the U.S. can have different rules. Different countries have different rules. Certainly individuals would define what is and isn't crime differently. Your book posits really there are two main models, and believe me, there are others, but let's just stick with this focus. The consensus model, which I would say is the more optimistic model, says society, though diverse, shares the same moral value system. It assumes that we can have these similar morals, and that morals are principles of what is right and wrong. Criminal acts conflict with these values. Society as a group deems them harmful and makes them illegal. The conflict model is, I would say, a little bit more cynical. It says that people don't have constant moral attitudes, and the content of the criminal law is determined by those that hold political power in the community, some of which might have been in the past, but are imposed upon the present. These groups impose those values. They decide what is and isn't a crime. Now, I said there's more than that because I don't want you to fall into the false dichotomy. Very often, people will say, well, there's only two choices. It's either A or B, and that's usually not true. There's a famous example in a courtroom where someone is being cross-examined, and the attorney says, answer the question yes or no. Give me a dichotomy. It's either this or this. Have you stopped beating your wife? Well, if you have to answer yes or no, if you say there's only two options, if you say yes, that means you did beat your wife in the past, which may not be true. If you say no, that means you haven't stopped beating your wife, which means it's true. The question itself makes certain presumptions. So be careful when someone says it's got to be consensus, or it's got to be conflict, or it's got to be A, or it's got to be B. Not every truth, of course, is subject to a compromise. Sometimes it's a blend, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is one or the other. So be careful because dichotomies do exist. Some say the earth is round, others say it's flat. The compromise position, oh no, the earth is an ovoid or is a pancake. No, that's not true. The earth is round. One group is right, in fact. Deviance is a concept that we explore. Deviance is behavior that goes against the norms. Very often, deviant acts become criminal. So if you enjoy torturing small animals, that's deviant behavior. We've criminalized that. Fortunately, most people don't enjoy torturing small animals. Now, not everything that only a small group of people do, hence being deviance, is illegal. So, for example, very few people listen to opera. Very few people speak Danish. It doesn't mean that everybody who commits those deviant acts is a crime, and we don't even criminalize them. Some things that we all do become crimes. Almost everyone I know speeds at least a little bit, maybe 4 or 5 miles over the speed limit. So even though the norm in the society is everybody does this, we still criminalize it. We still say, well, you can't speed for good reasons. So deviance helps us as a guide, but isn't an absolute surety of what is deviance becomes a crime. Okay, the integrated definition of crime. Using the consensus and the conflict model, we can construct a useful definition. Crime is something that is punishable under the criminal law as defined by a majority or powerful minority. It is considered offense against society as a whole and is prosecuted by public officials or the state. It is punished by a statute determined by things such as fines, loss of liberty, it's jail, or taking your own life, take your life, capital punishment. There is a formal criminal justice system. That is the law enforcement agencies, shorthand there would be the police, and we're going to have 3 or 4 chapters on the police. The courts, we'll have again 3 or 4 chapters on the courts, and the correction institutions, prisons, jails, probation. It is designed explicitly to enforce the criminal laws. Now there's other reasons for having the criminal justice system. And yes, it does protect us from what we deem to be criminal behavior, but there may be other motives for these groups. Now, just because other motives exist doesn't mean that the formal criminal justice system doesn't do what it states it does do. The informal system, really is a function of the stakeholders. What do people use the criminal justice system for beyond enforcing the law? Well, one of the things it uses it for is it employs people. People become cops not as volunteers, but because they get paid. People are defense attorneys because they get a check. People are judges because they get paid for it. So one of the goals is employment inside the system. But you can also use it for other things, clearly. Okay, there are different types of crime. Most people, when they think of crime, think of either violent crime or property crime. Violent crime being the worst. These are crimes committed against people. Murder, sexual assault, battery, robbery, and then your property crimes, larceny, burglary, motor vehicle. I'll let you look at those and read each one. We then have our public order crimes, sometimes called, I would say, inaccurately, victimless crimes, white-collar crimes, which we talked about that with wage theft, and then cyber crimes. Getting back to the purpose of the system, there are those purposes which are stated when it's created and enforced and supported, and those are purposes that are a mix of other things that intrude into it. Nothing exists in a vacuum. So yes, some degree of every system is going to be impacted by something like racism or sexism or the economic system, the need for people to earn a living. The stated purpose of the criminal justice system is to protect society from potential future crimes of the most dangerous offenders, to determine when a crime's been committed, and to punish those, to rehabilitate those who've been punished so you can return them, and to support victims in return to their pre-crime status. These are all noble goals. But we can ask, do we really do this? Does the current system protect from future crimes? Or are you really punishing in the past? How have we been determining when a crime occurs and what punishment's appropriate? How do we rehabilitate people? Do we really support the crime victim? Are they really the focus of our efforts? There are obviously going to be unstated purposes. Sometimes it can be the suppression of internal opposition. Sometimes it can be the maintenance of an established order. I already said it could be simply economic employment. Here's an example. John Ehrlichman was the counsel and assistant to the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and in an interview he said, talking about drugs and why they became illegal, "You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate hippies," which they identified as those opposed to the war, with marijuana, and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, Ehrlichman said. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. They knew that the purpose, the stated purpose, wasn't this. Now, it doesn't mean that some people in the system didn't truly believe that drugs were bad, didn't truly believe that they were disruptive, but it meant that there were other competing reasons why drugs became illegal and subsequently had much harsher penalties. All right, justice is another concept you hear. Justice is the quality of fairness in determining guilt or innocence. It's another one of those words that really can really be defined in a lot of different ways. People have a lot of different definitions, and you're informed by your own ideas. Again, your ethnocentric, your chronocentric ideas of what is and isn't justice. The structure of the criminal justice system, remember, we're a federalist system, and that means that we've got both the state and the feds. We have, again, those three components, the police, the courts, and the prisons. The state system of police, you've got, for example, in North Carolina, this is one of those examples where we're going to see some specific North Carolina information. We have split our state police into two groups, the Highway Patrol and the SBI. Now, there's a few other ones, but it's what's called a bifurcated system. Some states have unified them. They have the state police. We have the Highway Patrol and the FBI. Having said that, though, most law enforcement, most policing is done at the local level, the city and the county. If you're going to get arrested, you're going to get arrested by a cop or a sheriff, not a highway patrolman, not an FBI agent, but a local cop. So here in Wake County, you've got the Wake County Sheriff's Department, the Raleigh Police Department. Of course, you've got a bunch of the smaller towns as too. Cary, Garner, Fuquay, they all have police departments as well. The federal system, of course, operates across the United States, even outside our nation's boundaries, and there's lots of different agencies. We're going to look at many of those agencies when we get to policing. Here's a breakdown of some of the numbers to give you a quick idea of what we're talking about. You'll notice that local law enforcement, this first pie chart here, if I can bring it over, it's being recorded, I hope. You'll notice that local law enforcement is about 900,000 employed, and the state only has 100,000. So it's a 9-to-1 ratio of sheriffs and police to SBI or Highway Patrol. And then there's only 200,000 federal, so it's still a 9-to-2 ratio, 4-to-1 or whatever you want, 4.5-to-1, to the feds. It's just about as bad in that regards when you get to the courtroom. Only when you get to corrections, when you get to jails and prisons, is it even close. But there's where the state takes over. Still, the feds are small players. And overall, if you look at the numbers, that last one, the total, you'll see that really it's the locals that do most of the policing, most of the jailing, most of the corrections and the trials. All right, the court system, like the police, we have both a federal and a state court system. The feds try only federal crimes, just as state courts only try the crimes that occur inside those states. You have the participants inside. You've got, and this is the formal system, the judge, the prosecutor, who represents the state but should seek justice, and the defense attorney, who represents his client and whose primary purpose is to maintain his innocence. But there are informal duties. Judges can be motivated by self-interest, like public support, election, advancement. The prosecutors have a desire to win. They themselves are usually elected and advanced depending upon convictions. The defense attorney. As a defense attorney, my primary motivation was pay. If you couldn't pay me, I wasn't going to represent you. I also have to be aware of future relations and public expectations of a defense attorney. Corrections, once convicted of a crime, you usually have three options. Probation, which is the most common, will release you with or without supervision. Incarceration, you go into prison, usually for a felony, or jail, usually for misdemeanor. Community-based correction, alternative supervised monitoring, housework, halfway houses, things like that. Now, I didn't include the really rare one, which is obviously we could kill you. We have capital punishment in the United States. So the criminal justice process can be looked at a number of stages, and I'll refer you to page 16 of the 10th edition of our text. Determining what a crime is, the commission of that crime being detected, being reported, catching the guy that did it, determining are they guilty or not, and then punishing them. So to put some numbers on these bones, if we looked at violent deaths in the United States, the first thing you have to realize is most violent deaths are not homicides. If we're just looking at homicides. The most common violent death is suicide. It's twice, almost 3 times as likely to be a suicide as a homicide. Then you have to accept the idea that we don't necessarily detect that any given death is either violent or homicide. If you die in a hospital, there probably will be a cause of death listed, but there probably will be no autopsy. We might not discover that, oh, well, someone came into your room and injected you with something and killed you. So the estimates are that perhaps 50% of all homicides go undetected, or perhaps more accurately, unreported. The total reported homicides in 2019 was about 16,000. Now you'll notice again that's down significantly from the 1990s. Then we have, did anybody get arrested or cleared? So we clear about 60% of those. So some way or another we figured out. We arrest about 5,000 people a year. So about 30% of people get arrested. You could have something cleared because, I was robbing the Piggly Wiggly. I shot someone, there's a homicide. Then I was shot myself and died. We would clear that. We would say, okay, we solved the murder of the clerk, and you're dead. So it's cleared. If we do have an arrest, about 30% of the cases wind up with arrests. You go to trial. You are convicted about 70% of the time. So if we looked at our raw number there, about 16,4, and we look our conviction for homicide, it's about 3,400, you can see that roughly, very roughly, the odds are about 25% that you're going to get caught, convicted, and go to jail for a homicide. Now, again, even if I say go to jail, there's wide variations for conviction for killing someone. The most serious in North Carolina, first-degree murder, your sentence is going to be life without parole or capital punishment. The least serious, we have in North Carolina statute, misdemeanor death by motor vehicle, whereby, because you were committing a very, very minor infraction, like maybe you ran a stop sign and you hit someone, you very well could serve no time whatsoever for a homicide. You could wind up with just a fine or some probation. So be aware that you have an abstract system, determination what is a crime, the commission of the crime, the detection of the crime, the apprehension of the person, the determination of guilt, and punishment. But remember that most deaths are not homicides. Homicide's not even in the top 10. You're far more likely to have a stroke or die of cancer, or it could be anything depending upon what group you fall into winds up taking your life. Okay, a couple more terms we look at is discretion and ethics. We have to understand that all resources inside the criminal justice system, whether we're talking about the police, the courts, or the prisons, are finite. There's only so much. So we have to decide, we have to exercise discretion, who gets arrested, who gets tried, who goes to jail. The police, the courts, and correctional system all make this decision and then decide how to carry out this decision. Now, that's objectively true. We can look at the numbers. How many people were arrested for marijuana possession, for example. But often the motivation behind this is less clear, leading to informal decisions of very great consequences, such as a large number of people might be smoking marijuana. We know that rates are pretty similar for the genders and pretty similar between the races, but we also know that if you're a African American, you're about 3 times more likely to be arrested for simple possession in North Carolina as if you're white. So you can ask questions like, okay, so there's been some sort of discretion being exercised here, we assume. Where? Why? How? Is it racism? Is it economic conditions? Is it physical conditions, like where people live? What's behind this? And that can be very hard to tease out. Informal decision-making or discretion exists everywhere. There may be an interpretation of law. Very often, this rests upon the police or the prosecution to decide to bring charges. If you're caring for someone and you've been taking care of them for 20 years and they're very ill and you were supposed to change their oxygen tank and one day you fall asleep and they die, and the cause of death is determined, the question is, would a prosecuting attorney at that point decide, well, I'm going to bring a murder charge there? Or would they simply decide not to prosecute, even for a death? So you do have to understand that every individual act, every individual is unique by their very nature. And you're going to have to apply general rules to individuals, which usually requires discretion. Ethics is the practical application of morality, or what is right and wrong. Now, not everything that is the law and the application of law is just, because you can have unfair laws. Ethics really requires us to understand what is justice and to engage in critical thinking. But how far do we take that? How far do we allow people to substitute their own ethical standards for what the law is? Ethics, from the Greek ethos, meaning character, is the rational way of deciding what's good for individuals or good for society, because there can be individual ethics and societal ethics. Morality is what is right and wrong, often arising from the whole society, from religion or culture. Okay, criminal justice today, we're going to get ready to finish up. I like to keep these at about 40 or 45 minutes. There is an ongoing struggle between two, and again, don't fall into that false dichotomy because there's others, between two competing points of view. Crime control, where the issue is let's catch people who commit crimes, and due process, where you say let's make sure innocent people don't suffer. So we all can seek things like smarter policing, evidence-based practice, but sometimes it can lead to things like greater surveillance, more facial recognition software. A good example of this is gun control. If you want to lower the number of homicides by firearms in the United States, which is a high number, and you want to deal with issues like mass shootings, you could have background checks. You could have mental health issue checks. But how far do you take this? Do you prevent people who have ever been diagnosed as mentally ill from owning a gun? What if their lives are threatened? What things in your past should preclude you from owning a gun? Should anybody own a gun? All of these are major issues that can be decided and are really struggles between these two. Now, we also have to accept, and when we get to the police, we'll talk much more about this, that the advent of technology has changed policing. Things like police misconduct have moved out of the realm of just, well, that's just a story. You can't trust a criminal who says the cop shot him in the back or beat him, to something that we see often night after night. The scope remains a contention because you will hear increasingly it's just a few bad apples. I will say that increasingly the police have lost public support and are under pressure to engage in reform. And this comes from movements like Defund the Police. It comes from different movements throughout society. Of course, there's counter movements. But the police have to recognize and deal with this if they're going to be effective. So here are the two models quickly. The crime control model, which I talked about, its primary goal is, stated at least, stopping crime. So more arrests are very often better than necessarily the right arrest. A presumption of guilt. If you catch them, they're likely the ones that did it. Less adversarial, more assembly line. Less, let's focus on trials and stuff, let's move this through. More focused on what happened, not the process. And more power goes to the police and the prosecutors. Now, due process is different. It says individual rights are our primary concern. The right arrest, not just any arrest. The presumption of innocence, having trials, more focus on the process of how we got there than on what the result is. And it gives more power to defense attorneys. Homeland Security and Domestic Terrorism. Now, traditional law enforcement was focused on foreign terrorists, particularly after 9/11. But we've seen a shift back, and I don't think this is any surprise. America has gone through cycle after cycle of domestic terrorism. And you could make the argument, and I would not, but you could start with the argument of saying, well, the country was founded by an act of terrorism, the destruction of property, and that would be the Boston Tea Party. Now, obviously, the Sons of Liberty weren't killing people openly, and it's inappropriate to say they're the same as, some of the horrible groups that operated. But terrorism is something that has existed. The use of violence, the use of force outside the laws exist in the United States for a long time. The KKK operated openly for more than 100 years in the United States, between the 1860s and the 1960s and 70s, and still exists. And you cannot describe the KKK as anything other than a terrorist organization by its very structure. Conversely, you've got the anarchist groups of the early 1900s that set off bombs and killed people and assassinated kings and did all sorts of terrible things. So terrorism always has existed inside the United States. It's not new. Prison populations. We do know that prison populations skyrocketed 500% between 1980 and 2008. Very slowly they seem to be going down. We do know that the death penalty is applied less and less. We know that people are looking at issues of race and incarceration. That's something that we're going to certainly talk about when we get to incarceration. We know that we're really starting to ask the question, does it make sense to lock up large numbers of people? Is it cost effective? Does it serve the interests of justice? Does it help them? Does it help their victims? All right, the last thing to mention here is micro lectures. Now, these might be a little slow for me to get up, but I'll get them up. I will be posting short, usually 5-minute lectures about things like statistics or ethnocentrism or due process or domestic terrorism, just in case you have more questions about them than I had time. So I would look for those in the same areas here, and I will provide links when I can. All right, well, that's Chapter 1. We'll move on to Chapter 2 pretty soon, but you all have a good evening, good night, good day.